Hello, derived energy. I'm going to read this essay that I wrote when I was at university studying psychology, and it's about consciousness, and it got 72%, so it just scraped a thirst. And it's entitled, "What Chance Do We Ever Have of Understanding Consciousness?" And I begin thus. In order to address this question, we not only need to be clear about what we mean by consciousness, but also by the type of knowledge about consciousness that would constitute an understanding of it. Consciousness has been described as at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious, Chalmers. This sentence captures the paradox of consciousness. We are aware of nothing without it, but when it comes to describing and understanding it, we are left with unsatisfactory definitions that barely seem to scratch its surface. Chalmers has given us an incomplete list of experiences, including thoughts, mental imagery, emotion, and sense of self, that are, it would seem, always accompanied by consciousness. However, though they try to help us to think about the issue of consciousness, they do not, in themselves, indicate what consciousness actually is. Consciousness, like so many other abstract psychological concepts, such as attitude and extroversion, has been subject to many different interpretations by psychologists. In this essay, the term consciousness will be used not only in the sense Vellman's articulates, self-consciousness is a special form of consciousness in which the object of consciousness is the self, or some aspect of the self, but also in the sense of having access to both phenomenal experiences and information stored within one's memory. Vellman's argues that a comprehensive understanding of consciousness, along with a definition of what it actually is, must include accounts of its function, its relationship to the brain, and whether it is causally efficacious. It is with these criteria in mind that evaluations of both the progress that has been made in this area and the problems inherent in studying consciousness will be made. Together, these answers will hopefully put us in a position to answer whether we will ever truly comprehend consciousness. Prior to 1879, there was no scientific methodology used in order to investigate consciousness, and the matter was left entirely to philosophers. One of the main difficulties in understanding consciousness, often termed the hard problem, is reconciling our physical bodies with the ability to have subjective, non-physical mental experiences. This was a difficulty that Descartes saw all too clearly, and he proposed a theory called Cartesian dualism, which proposes that mind matter is completely distinct from the physical matter our bodies are composed of. Intuitively appealing as this theory is at first glance, due to its temporary circumnavigation around the hard problem of consciousness, it poses the difficult problem of necessitating an explanation of how mind matter and physical matter interact. If Descartes is right, of course, the implications for the study of consciousness are profound. How as psychologists can we study a phenomena that is not dependent, or as Chalmers put it, supervenient on the observable physical world? This problem of accounting for a person's subjective experience purely through detailing physical facts about another human being was highlighted by Jackson's discussion of Mary, the colour scientist who had never seen colours. Dennett argues that Mary would in fact know what it is like to experience colours, because he believes that knowledge of all the physical facts enables a person to know what an experience is like. By advocating this view, he is supporting the idea that qualia, or the subjective quality of experience, do not exist. Chalmers, on the other hand, argues the subjective experience of colour vision are not entailed by the physical facts. There seems no easy way to resolve this argument. However, even if we side with Dennett, the hope of giving a purely physical account of consciousness is, if possible, an account that will not be possible for a long time, given the complexity of the human brain, the imprecision of our machines that can measure brain activity, and the ineffability we struggle with when we try to describe to someone our conscious experiences. During the brief history of psychology, the way in which psychologists have approached consciousness has been determined, in no small part, by the prevalent paradigm of the time. Wundt is credited as being the first person to study consciousness experimentally. Using a method of experimental introspection, psychologists of the time were interested in the relationship between the presentation of visual and sensory stimuli and people's conscious experiences of them. However, they stumbled into the problem of understanding a first-person perspective from a third-person or scientific perspective. In other words, it is possible to measure a person's external behavior, such as counting the number of times a participant presses a button or measuring their brain activity, relatively accurately and objectively, but a difficulty arises when you attempt to assume what a person is actually consciously experiencing in their mind at any one given moment. This problem of introspection led to the birth of behaviorism, which placed consciousness, or indeed any other mental event, outside the realm of scientific inquiry. At this time it seemed that there was never any hope of expanding our knowledge about consciousness. Fortunately, however, from around the 1960s onwards, psychology went through yet another paradigm shift, and an interest in studying psychology from a cognitive perspective dominated the discipline. This approach is interested in explaining the human brain in terms of an information processing system, and it was successful in informing us about various processes relating to consciousness, such as perception, attention, and memory. Broadbent, for example, showed us that a rigid dichotomy between conscious and unconscious perception was misleading, and he argued that we should treat consciousness as a variable subject to fluctuations. Cherry had previously commented on this by noting the cocktail party phenomena, that is, the phenomena when people become aware of their name being spoken at a party, despite not consciously attending to the speaker's speech. These findings suggested that we should reconceptualize our idea of consciousness as an all-or-nothing phenomena. Another area cognitive psychologists were interested in was the concept of subliminal learning, that is, learning without conscious awareness. This work was illuminating because it caused psychologists to question whether consciousness was essential to learning as had previously been thought. This will be discussed later. The limitations of applying a cognitive approach towards the understanding of consciousness, however, must be stressed. Despite the wealth of knowledge that has been accumulated concerning the structure and function of psychological concepts relating to consciousness, it is still not at all clear why these operations should lead to awareness of these processes. This problem is reflected in the argument concerning whether it is logically possible to design a computer that has a mind, in the sense that given the right program it can be said to understand and have other cognitive states. If we could build a computer that exhibited consciousness, it would not only be an awe-inspiring achievement, but it would also explain consciousness in all the ways identified by Vellmans. However, this is where a philosophical and hence controversial argument ensues. It has been put forward by Searle that it is impossible to explain human understanding and hence consciousness purely by appealing to the manipulation of formal symbols within a computer program. For this reason, he strongly opposes the logical possibility of a conscious man-made computer. His Chinese room argument is intuitively seductive, as it forces us to consider how the mere transformation of input, for instance human speech, into output, for example a verbal response, is sufficient grounds for conscious awareness of its behavior. Dennett, however, argues that if we are to adopt a materialist position to consciousness, we must admit that genuine understanding is somehow achieved by a process composed of interactions between a host of subsystems, none of which understand a thing by themselves. He accepts that this is at first a counterintuitive proposal, but he suggests that people's reticence to accept this possibility is a result of applying an insufficient degree of imagination concerning the complexity of the computer in the Chinese room thought experiment. Another area of psychological inquiry that has given us clues regarding the nature of consciousness is derived from neuropsychological observations and reports. Weiskrantz focuses on an aspect of consciousness that allows us to acknowledge awareness or to offer a commentary on such functions as responding to and discriminating between stimuli. He has observed some striking disjunctions between verbal responses and patients' actual demonstrable capacities. Amnesic syndrome patients, for example, have shown us that despite not being able to recall the learning event or situation, they can still demonstrate excellent retention of the effects of exposure to those events or situations. This has been cited as evidence to support the idea of access consciousness, a special form of consciousness that is responsible for people's ability to bring a past event to conscious awareness. Another type of cognitive impairment that has been studied is blind sight, a term credited to Wes-Krantz, which is caused by brain injury to the primary visual cortex area V1. Blind sight refers to people's ability to make accurate responses to visual stimuli, such as locating flashes of light and guessing whether an object is stationary or in motion, despite being unable to have any phenomenal awareness of seeing them due to the stimuli being presented to a blind spot in the patient's visual field. This seems to also support Bloch's distinction of consciousness as an ability to consciously experience stimuli in the outside world. These findings beg the question, what else can these patients tell us about the function and structure of consciousness? Firstly, it seems to suggest that consciousness is not limited to one area of the brain. In addition, it gives reason to believe that all the processes involved in generating consciousness do not necessarily interact with other cognitive functions such as perception and memory, as amnesic patients arguably do show signs of implicit learning even though they are unable to remember the learning event it is associated with. Furthermore, it could be inferred that without consciousness, people's ability to think visually and to guide action relevant to such imagery, or to compare past with present, to reflect, to link separate past events, to order them, and to do so in relation to oneself as a coherent thing, is seriously compromised. In order to account for such disassociations between conscious awareness and specific cognitive functions, for example face recognition, prosopagnosia, spatial awareness, lexical information, Shakhtar proposed a dissociable interactions and conscious experience DICE model. This model depicts the brain as a system that has different distinct modules that are responsible for various cognitive capacities and that link up with the conscious awareness system. This model offers a neat explanation why brain damaged patients exhibit specific impairments in experiencing stimuli. However, it must be made clear that the claim that there are disconnections between particular cognitive capabilities and conscious phenomenal experiences has been met with criticism. One of the biggest arguments against such claims is the fact that such speculations rest on the verbal reports of the patients rather than on behavioural responses. As Goldman points out, verbal reportability is not a necessary condition for a state to be conscious. By this he means that an ability to verbally report an inner state does not automatically presuppose consciousness, and conversely, by itself, verbal reportability is insufficient evidence to infer the presence of consciousness. He uses the example of animals and computers respectively to support these arguments. However, we do not as yet know whether animals are conscious, and my tutor wrote, surely they are. And yeah, I accept that, some animals are conscious at least. And it seems facetious to claim that as computers can verbally report but are not conscious, the same argument should necessarily be applied to humans. His argument that some states of awareness may be too fleeting or incoherent to link up with the apparatus of a verbal report is more persuasive, however, because at the moment it is difficult to imagine how we could detect such a state by observing the brain activity of a patient or by observing their manifest behaviour. To conclude, it has been argued that consciousness is not a unitary phenomenon, but should be regarded as discrete capacities, self-consciousness, access consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness, that interact with specific cognitive functions such as face recognition and visual perception. The issue as to whether consciousness could ever be realized in the computer program and whether a reductionist account of consciousness is possible are felt as of now to be largely a matter for philosophical concern, most notably because of the tremendous problems inherent of both explaining qualia in terms of brain activity and accounting for a first-person perspective from a scientific perspective. The function of consciousness has been argued to be essential in maintaining our sense of self and orientation in the world. As for the question of whether consciousness is causally efficacious in human information processing, it has been put forward that certain cognitive abilities, such as perception and memory, operate relatively successfully independent of conscious control, but that a person's ability to function is severely hampered without it. Due to all these reasons, it is felt that we have made considerable progress in the quest to understand consciousness since the days of Descartes. However, the problems of truly understanding consciousness is formidable indeed, and perhaps we should be content with further sharpening our understanding of consciousness without expecting a definitive, painstakingly accurate understanding of this fascinating phenomenon. I hope you enjoyed that essay.